Hello and welcome to Fresh Take from What Fresh Hell Laughing in the Face of Motherhood. This is Margaret, and today I'm talking to Cameron Normand. Cameron is a lawyer who worked in national politics for 23 years on Capitol Hill and leading policy strategy at 2 different movie studios before leaving her career last year to found Stepfamily Solutions, the leading company that brings together resources and experts to help stepfamilies navigate their challenges. Through her coaching, courses, magazine, and summit, she has helped thousands of stepmoms and stepfamilies navigate their blended lives. Welcome, Cameron.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
So people often talk on the podcast about kind of the moment or like the thing that brought them to this work. Often like I looked for resources and I didn't find them anywhere. Obviously you had this whole other career. What made you want to talk about stepfamilies?
Well, it's funny, talking about the moment as stepmoms, we always talk about the bathroom floor moment. When you are at that sort of rock bottom, looking around, realizing it's not at all what I thought it was going to be like, and I don't know how to do this, and I feel alone and nobody's out there to help me. So it was when I had mine that I kind of was like, there's got to be a way for me to figure this out. And because the resources weren't really there, you go to the bookstore, or I guess now you go on Amazon, I'm dating myself. You go to the bookstore and, you see all of these resources on parenting and momming and, there's all this stuff and there's not much out there for stepmoms. And the stuff that was out there, and I looked, I'm a lawyer by training. So I was like, just give me the blueprint. I'm good. Like, I'll be fine.
I can figure this out.
We
always say
out,
people
right?
are a Margaret or an Amy. You're an Amy. Just like, I'm going to go to the bookshelf and I'm going to get the answer.
I'm going to do this, right? And there wasn't anything there. And so that's when I kind of was like, okay, I need to like really dig deeper and try and figure this out. And then when I was kind of able to cobble everything together, I was like, there must be a million other stepmoms out there who are struggling like I did and not able to figure it out. And it turns out that there are. It can be a really difficult and challenging position, and there weren't enough resources. So I kind of decided to pull together experts and create a place for stepmoms and stepfamilies to come to get what they need.
One of the things we like to start with on the podcast is kind of, let's define it. And so what is the definition of a stepmom? Are all stepmoms created equally? People become stepmoms in different ways. What do you imagine as the definition of a stepmom?
Yeah, and that's a good question because it does look different in every family, right? You can become a stepmom if you marry someone who is divorced or has lost their spouse to death. Stepmom is someone who comes in to a pre-existing family structure where there's a parent and their kids. And other than that, everything can look different, right?
Right.
You can be a stepmom without actually being married. And I have a lot of stepmoms come to me and they're like, well, I'm not really a stepmom because we're not married. I'm like, no, you're totally a stepmom. Like, you have a partner, whether you're married or not, whether you're straight or not, like, you're a stepmom, So the definition is similar, but it looks a lot of different. It's got a lot of different shapes and sizes.
That's right. Because the point of origin, it feels like a stepmother who might be coming in a contentious divorce situation, possibly a relationship that overlapped somehow and was, involved to some degree with the divorce, seems very different than maybe a widowed partner who's been alone for 10 years and is maybe, hooray, finally bringing in someone to help with the family. Is that something that you find in the work, that like how the origin story of the stepmom kind of can define a lot of the relationships?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And there are so many different factors, right? Like in the widow example, does the widow have young kids who are like excited about a new mom? Or are the kids teenagers or maybe, young adults or adults? And they're like, well, wait a minute, I had all of dad's attention and now there's this woman. And, there are lots of different complicating factors. My in-laws both got remarried the same summer my husband and I got married. And they're in their 70s. And they had been divorced for like 20 years. And for them, it was great. All the kids were really excited about the new spouses. And they, of course, married these lovely people and it, worked out very nicely. But there are lots of situations where you have adult kids and they're like, well, wait a minute, who's this woman coming in? And what does that mean for like all the, inheritance I thought I was getting. And, I mean, there's just lots of different factors that can complicate even that situation, right?
Absolutely.
But obviously, when you do have a living ex-spouse, even if it's not contentious, it can still be complicated, right? Because kids have these, competing feelings about like, well, but I have a mom, and, is it bad if I like develop a relationship with this new lady?
Sure, right. The
And especially
loyalty
if it is
question,
contentious.
right.
Yeah. And if mom's not thrilled about it, then that complicates it even more. So there are just lots of different combinations and mix it
For
up a little bit.
sure. It's the classic. It's like being a mom. It's one situation. There's a ton of commonalities that everybody faces.
Yes.
And then the variables are so vast that sometimes it feels like having a conversation about motherhood. You're just like, well,
Totally.
it's for everybody.
Totally. And there are a lot of commonalities that, you can work with people in these different situations. And there are common feelings and experiences that every stepmom has, but there are a lot of different pieces to the puzzle in every family.
So let's dial in specifically using examples. There's some step parenting in my family through my husband's family, and lots of friends who are dealing with this. So let's talk about just some practical questions that people
Sure.
be dealing with as step parents. Um, let's start with the most obvious one. You come into a situation where the stepchild or stepchildren truly don't like you, aren't welcoming to you, and it's war from day one. What is your advice to people in a situation like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard, right? Because
Super
I think
hard.
for most stepmoms, here you are, the adults in the situation are like super excited that they found each other. They're
Right.
thrilled about this union. And then you come in and you're like, wait a minute, I thought surely I'd win these kids over. Like, it's fine. Like me, I'm pretty nice when they like me,
Right.
So what I would say is the first thing is think about where the kids are coming from and what their dynamic is, right? So, does the ex have any impact on the kids? Is the ex favorable towards you, or is it have conflict? Is she not happy about it? Because that can influence the kids. And what you don't want to do is add to any loyalty binds that they're already feeling. Because if they feel like mom isn't happy about you being around, they're probably not going to be happy about you being around. And you don't want to get into a battle royale with mom. That's a bad place to be and bad for the kid. So really,
you said add to loyalty binds, correct?
Yes.
Let's double click on that. You don't want to, what does it mean exactly? You don't want to play the game? You don't want to pull the rope? What does it mean to not add to the loyalty binds?
Any kid who is in a situation where there's a stepmom coming in,
right,
even when all the adults like each other,
right,
they're going to feel a little bit torn between mom and stepmom. They're going to feel a little guilty if they really like stepmom.
right.
Does that mean they like mom less? I mean, they're kids, right? Their brains aren't fully developed. They are not able to sort of work through all of these complicated emotions, much less identify them, right? So, you're sort of guessing that all this stuff is going on. But a lot of times, the loyalty binds exist, even if it's not high conflict. If it is high conflict, if mom is really pissed that mom is really upset that, her ex has moved on with someone new, she may be making comments to the kid. You have no way of knowing. And so putting yourself in the child's shoes and kind of saying, what are they dealing with here? And trying to make it as easy for them as possible, trying to alleviate some of their feelings of being torn, making clear that you're not trying to replace mom. You just want to get to know them and develop your own relationship if that's what they want.
Mm-hmm.
Really following their lead on the timeline. Like it takes a long time. Research says 5 to 7 years for a blended family to really blend. So you got to play the long game with these kids, right? And looking for opportunities to bond with them is great. One-on-one bonding with the family. But you have to follow their lead. Mm-hmm. If they don't want it, you got to be patient. And you don't need to force them into like, okay, we're going to have family fun time with Cameron. You two are going to go to the zoo together. that is not going to go well if the kid does not want to spend time with you.
Right. A kid, we know this. Any kid can outlast you. I mean,
Oh
they
my
can
God.
dial in and they will be sitting on the floor of the zoo for 6 hours being
Totally.
like, I will not even look at a zebra because that is how committed I am.
Totally. And so it's really, it's a patience game.
Yeah.
And it's really taking things at their pace and being really sensitive to what they want. Now, that does not mean that you have to put up with disrespect or that you have to like completely roll over. If the disrespect is going on, your partner needs to address. You don't need to get into a battle with the kid. That's also not a good place to be.
Interesting. Okay. I want to pick that up after the break about discipline because I think that's a whole
Big one.
It's really complicated, right? I'm talking to Cameron Norman. She is the founder of Stepfamily Solutions, and we'll be right back. So, yes, when it comes to discipline, I'm assuming we're talking about people who are sharing a home with kids who are there some significant amount of the time. And I know that this gets very, very sticky because you are an adult in the house. I mean, I discipline my nieces and nephews. I discipline my friends' kids when they come over. Like, hey, cut it out. That's not, we don't talk that way, whatever it happens to be. But it seems that discipline is especially fraught in the step-parent relationship. So what's your advice to people on discipline?
The short answer is don't do it. The longer answer is, as a step mom or step parent, your focus, especially in the beginning, really needs to be bonding with the kid and building that relationship. And when you jump into discipline, that really impacts the ability to bond with them. So I had a therapist once explain it to me like this, and I love this analogy. When you have a family from, birth or whatever, there's a memory bank of positive memories that the kids build up with their parent. So when mom yells at Johnny about leaving his shoes in the front hall, he can take it. He's got a whole bank of positive memories that he can fall back on, right? But when I come in as new stepmom and I'm like, get those shoes out of the hall or you're grounded, he doesn't have that positive bank of memories with me. He's just thinking, what a jerk.
Right.
Why is she speaking to me like that?
Right. And he's definitely going, you're not my mom on the inside.
Oh my God,
right?
Totally. And so it's really important for step parents to build that positive memory bank, right?
That makes a lot of sense.
Before you start on the discipline.
But now if I'm home with kids, let's say partner is not there, I'm home alone, there must be some role to be saying like, it's not, they're going to test you to a certain point, right?
Oh,
They're
absolutely.
going to push. And so how do you handle, there must be times where you have to do some discipline.
Yes, those times get tricky, right? Because, you're in your house and like, what are you supposed to do? And I definitely had that. Our first year of marriage, my husband was military and was working this really demanding assignment where I was getting all 4 kids either up and ready for school or home and putting them to bed. And as a brand new stepmom, like that's a really hard place to be because if they're not listening to you,
in the deep end.
The way deep end. But what I would say is the best thing you can do in that situation, and sometime, if it's a work assignment or whatever, unavoidable, the best thing I can say to do is to really sit down and try to have your spouse pre-teach with the kid. Like, hey, I'm going to be doing this. Cameron's here. Like, you guys need to listen to her in the same way that you would listen to any other adult who would be in this house and telling you what to do. And then if something goes haywire and off the rails, do what you can in the moment and let your spouse handle it when they get home. So,
that makes sense.
Johnny looks at you and says, you're not my mom. I don't have to have dinner right now. Okay, well, Johnny, why don't you go to your room and we'll talk about this when dad gets home or mom gets home.
That makes sense.
You're trying in the moment as much as possible. It's really hard, especially if the kids have totally gone off the rails, because we know they do.
Right.
But as much as possible, if you can kind of kick the can a little bit and then have the conversation with your spouse when they get home, and let them handle the meeting out of any kind of discipline.
That's the discipline part. And
yeah.
I think we talk a lot about this in parenting in general, is kind of showing the kids the steps a little bit. Does that make sense for step parenting as well? Sometimes to say, I'll say to my kids, listen, I have my big project at work due this week, and your dad's out of town, and this week is going to be really hard. And like, there may be more yelling, whatever it is, like trying to, obviously you're not doing this with a 2-3-year-old, although a 2-3-year-old is like, human taking care of me, great, generally. So as kids become sentient, is there room to have conversations with kids about like, hey, you guys don't know me that well. I don't know you that well. I'm here trying to take over for the day. Like, let's make the best of it. And
yes, absolutely. And I love that you brought that up, because one of the things that I think a lot of stepmoms are afraid to do, but I think is actually important and really helpful, is like, don't be afraid to call out a little bit of awkwardness. Like, hey, I know we're here, and and I've said to mine at different points, like, hey, I know there are probably times you want mom and dad to get together and you wish that I weren't even here.
right.
You know what? That doesn't bother me.
Right.
And you can only say it if it really doesn't bother you, right? Because kids know. They've got a
I think you might even be able to say, like, it's hard. This whole dynamic is
Yeah,
hard for everybody.
I know this is hard for you.
Yeah.
Yeah. And kids, being able to empathize with them in the moment is huge.
Yeah.
Huge. They're receptive to that when you can say, look, I know this is hard for you. Like, I'm this new person. Like, we all have different habits. You don't really know how I do things. And, we're all trying to make this work. So, like, tell me what's bothering you. And like, I want you to be able to, don't feel bad about saying something to me. Don't feel like you're going to hurt my feelings. Like, it's okay for you to say how you feel,
Yeah. All right. Here's a random one. What should the kids call you?
Yeah, that is, so I want to say anything except mom. Because, and I know that there are some people out there that would quibble with this. And again, it depends on your dynamic. Like,
Sure.
if mom has passed away and, you've been with the kids since birth, like, maybe that's a different thing. There are situations, it's not a blanket across the rule thing, but I think mom is maybe not okay. I would say whatever they're comfortable with. Like, I think first names are like the easiest. I was introduced to my stepkids as Cameron. My youngest stepson, I think it was maybe like the second time I met him, nicknamed me Tammy G. My maiden name starts with a G. And now all the kids, that's what they call me. So, and I love it. I think it's great.
Yeah, it's it can be a funny dynamic, because I know there are people who don't like children to call adults by their first name in general, but it's like, they're not going to call you Mrs., right? They're not going to call you Mrs. Norman. That doesn't make sense. And so I think it can be a strangely sticky issue. Like, wait a minute. This is the one adult you're allowed to call by their first name. And we see that maybe as disrespectful in other realms. It's tricky.
It is tricky. And I grew up in the South. And so all adults were, if they weren't like Mr. or Mrs. last name, it was like, my godmother was Miss Retta.
Right.
Right. Miss whatever. And so like my godkids call me Miss Cameron. But yeah, you don't do that with stepmom, because that's more part of your family. So
Yeah.
I go with first name, but I think it's a really personal thing. And I think if you're concerned about what they should call you, if the kids are old enough, talk to them about it. I think that's a great conversation to like give them some ownership. They don't, if they want to call you Bob, like that may not be what you want to be called. Have the conversation with them, but they don't necessarily get the deciding factor. But if you give them a little bit of ownership, I think my youngest stepson loves that he came up with Kimmy G.
Yeah. And I think that what I'm picking up from that story too is leaving room for things to evolve.
Absolutely.
You can start as, this is the person's first name, and then maybe it does become a nickname. Like, the name evolves with the relationship. Like, a cute nickname makes sense for someone you're close to and you have love for, and that has a significant role in your life. But if you try to lead with that, it's like, whoa, we're not ready to be on cute terms yet.
Yeah, exactly.
We will be back and talk about maybe the stickiest issue of all, finances. I am talking to Cameron Norman, the founder of Stepfamily Solutions, and we'll be right back. Okay, so a lot of conflict here. And I want to say very clearly, conflict among a ton of people who have extremely good intention. It's not conflict because someone is the wicked stepmother. Finances become very complicated so that you can come into a situation where someone has children, you have whatever your own financial picture looks like. You have not been planning to have multiple children and pay college tuitions, and it gets extremely complicated extremely fast. So tell me some of the issues that you've seen around finances and how you see successful step families dealing with finances.
I love that you're bringing this up because it is not talked about enough. It's something that I have been out there talking about, and every time I get out and talk about it, I have people that are like, "Oh my gosh, thank you for saying that," because I just haven't known how to handle this. And it can be really complicated. And like you said, I mean, that was my situation. I was 40 when I met my husband, and I had had a long, successful career and built up my own assets, had my own house, all of that kind of stuff. And kids weren't in the picture. I wasn't thinking about anybody's college or any of that stuff. And I think the other challenge for step families is when you meet someone with kids, the last thing you're thinking about before you get married or move in together is like who's paying for college or sports uniforms or any of that stuff. You're focused on like the actual, all the practicalities of the day to day. And then you get into it. You're like, well, wait a minute.
What
does
call this
mean?
on the podcast? Good dancer. Oh no. How are we going to run a house together? Because basically you're like, cute face, good dancer, let's go. And then the next thing you know, you're making these complicated financial, who's going to fix the boiler, Not easy.
Totally. Again, I'll start with like maybe the cleanest way to handle things is get a prenup and keep everything separate.
Mm.
Now, is that realistic for everybody? We didn't sign a prenup. That it just wasn't for us. I mean, no shade on anybody that wants to have them. I think that they're really useful in a lot of circumstances. We just decided it wasn't for us. Keeping things separate is, I would say, more important because depending on the ages of the kids, depending on the level of conflict, if you end up in a situation where you have to go back to court over child support or whatever, you may not want your asset tied up in any of that. Now, and I'm a lawyer by training, but I do not practice family law, so that's my disclaimer.
This is a comedy podcast. Do not take legal advice from us.
Do not take legal advice from the comedy podcast. But
always a bad idea.
But I think in most cases, like your assets, the court doesn't want to pull your assets into everything, right? But sometimes if you have both your names on property, if you have a business together, I mean, all of that kind of stuff can get pulled in. If you have joint bank accounts, that gets pulled in. So, we actually merged all of our finances at first and then went back and separated after one of those kind of situations. And I think it is the cleanest thing until the kids are out of the house. Don't have to worry about, going back to court or any of that stuff, to just keep the separate account, have full transparency, obviously. But I think keeping it separate is the cleanest way to go. And the other thing is, if your spouse has not had a parenting plan written up that discusses college or, sports, prom dresses, cars, cell phone, I mean, there's a whole laundry list of stuff that most divorce decrees don't get into. And they get tricky, right? Because then you're like, well, what's my responsibility here? Now, I'll say, if you want to buy the stuff for your stepkids, buy the stuff for your stepkids. I mean, I do, but you may not want to. You may not have that relationship. It's a lot of different things that you have to consider. But to the extent that you can get a parenting plan, co-parenting plan that is really clear on that stuff, it'll help all of you going down. And you just don't have to have those discussions because it's already decided.
Yeah, and discussions with your spouse beforehand, and we talk
oh my goodness,
so much. I come from a Catholic tradition where we do something called pre-cana, where you sit down, and my husband and I went into it like oh, I can't believe we have to do this stupid thing. And we went in and we were like, these are the smartest questions we've ever heard. Like, how come we don't talk? Like, what do you want your financial picture to look like? Who do you expect to pay the bills in 10 years? Like, these conversations that we skip because we're like cute face, good dancer, they come up in all realms, which is you don't want to be having a fight every single time there's a purchase to be made of like, well, that's not me, that's not you. And I do think it's complicated because the flow of money between parents and children is it's kind of an open flow, and it's a kind of wall against the step parent if they're like, whoa, 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 like I'm not paying for X, Y, and Z. And people do have different financial pictures coming in. It's very complicated.
Yeah, it is. It's really complicated. And they're not easy discussions. And I would say the more you can have up front, that's absolutely right, the better.
And it also makes sense. I know people who've been in situations where they're going to qualify for financial aid for their children for college. A new spouse comes in and suddenly they don't qualify for financial aid if they have joint. I mean, there's so many practical decisions to make around finances that are not just emotional.
That's a really important point because the new FAFSA forms, step parent has to put their income in.
Yes. And let me tell you, they're not like, you're not really in the picture.
Yeah. I mean, and if you don't have a relationship with the stepchild, I mean, that kind of puts everybody in a bad position, right? Like you could disqualify them for getting aid, even though you're not supporting them in any way. I mean, it's bad policy. Like the lobbyist in me wants to like go to Capitol.
This is not. Yeah. And then how much, if at all, and obviously this depends on ages and stages, how much do you involve the kids in that conversation at all? Is there ever a time where you say like, well, step parents, may have this or that, and we're going to live in this house, but their money isn't our money? I mean, is there room to involve the kids in those conversations?
I think as they get older, maybe. I think certainly when they're young, I mean, we tried to not really talk about money with the kids when they were younger because we didn't want them to worry or feel like, put in the middle by any of the discussions. I think the older they get, I mean, especially around college, because they have to fill out a lot of these forms.
Yeah.
I think having some of those conversations is appropriate. And I think being transparent with them is great. You can. A lot of that is relational and really depends on how your relationship is with the kids.
So what is a piece of advice, if you could boil it down to one or two, before you ever became a stepmom, if you could give somebody one or two key pieces of advice, what would they be?
The first one I always tell people is go a little easier on yourself. I think stepmoms are in a pressure cooker. There's little support. They feel like they can't really complain about their situation because the response from society and frankly from a lot of other parents, it's like, well, you knew what you were getting into.
Right.
You married someone with kids.
You signed up for this. Yeah.
You signed up for this, all those things. So they feel really alone and they feel like they've got to hold it all together and make it all work. And so my biggest piece of advice for anyone going into it, like give yourself a little bit of grace. You're going to make mistakes. I made plenty. You're going to step in it here and there, I mean, just go a little easy on yourself. And along with that, you don't have to be perfect. I think a lot of us feel like we're coming into this family and you've got to throw the Pinterest perfect birthday parties. And, you've got to really, you've got to show up to every game and you've got to be there for everything. And you don't. You have to be yourself and, try and work on these relationships. But you don't need to be everything to everyone. And, there are some people that aren't going to like you or accept you. You have a high conflict relationship with your spouse's ex, you're never going to do enough to win her over. I mean, it just,
I'm great. No.
Yeah. And I went through that. It's like, why won't you like me? I'm fun.
Everyone likes me. I'm me. No, don't bother with that one.
Yeah.
And then if you were to say to this same, imaginary new stepmom, this is the pitfall. This is the thing to look out for. What would it be?
That's a good one. I think the most unexpected thing for me was it gets better with time, but it takes a lot of time. And stepmom can't, I mean, you hear parents all the time, like going to work or whatever at a meeting, like, oh, I got no sleep because Johnny kept me up last night, or I couldn't get Johnny up for school. It's such a pain. Well, if stepmom weighs into that, they kind of get looked at like they've got two heads, And so I think that is something that moms kind of have to like watch a little bit. You so badly want to fit into that mom club. You really do.
Mhm.
And you have to kind of tiptoe around a little bit. And I'd love to change that just in society. But right now, that's kind of what it is. So I would say, look for other stepmom friends.
That makes sense.
I was talking to someone a couple of years ago, and she's like, well, I mean, that's great and all, but it's not like stepmoms have a secret handshake or something. And I'm like, oh,
We kind of
kind of we do.
You definitely have a Facebook group.
I mean,
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And I will say from the many people I know as adults who were in step parent relationships as kids, I remember sitting around a pool at one point and, mom or dad came over and they were joking around and it was two sisters and they said, oh my gosh, we gave her hell when we were teenagers. We just tortured her. We wanted her out and she stuck around. And I think what I see is that in the long term, people know adults see the full picture of what's going on. We've said it on the podcast before, but someone said a long time ago in a religious context, we're not having a religious discussion, but that like life is looking at the back of the tapestry and heaven is walking around and to the front and seeing the picture. And I do think that there's something there in the step parent relationships that I've seen that like it's a mess for a while, but at some point the person is going to see the picture.
it is. And I think, if we could all, I mean, going back to your original point, if we could all kind of go in with the assumption that everybody's just trying to do the best job they can, and we might disagree on what the best thing to do is, but everyone's trying to do the best thing, even if you can't quite get there on what it is. But like people are coming in with good intention, really trying to be there for these kids, and kind of giving folks a little grace, I think, is a nice thing to do.
Giving grace, a nice thing to do. We've solved it, as we like to say on the podcast. Cameron, tell people where they can find more of you, more of the resources that you're offering.
So I'm at stepfamilysolutions.com, and that's where you can find Step Family Magazine, the Step Summit, our retreats, all of that good stuff. And then I'm at Stepfamily Solutions on all the socials.
Fantastic. And we will link to all of those places in our show notes. Cameron, thank you so much. This was a really useful conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.